years in the RMCTA and 2 years national service, so I'm steeped in medical corps history. Stephen's right, it was appalling. Absolutely, the scale of injuries was just appalling. Men were just mown down. Now, what the government then of the day did was to say, you'll become a military hospital, which means that precedence is given to wounded soldiers. And so the Royal Hospital was chosen. It was a military hospital. You can't just admit somebody with an hemorrhoid or a hernia. There weren't that many being done anyway, but the soldiers took precedence. So the Royal set aside 2 wards, the Alexandra and the Edward ward, about 50 beds. They had to enlarge them, of course, and received the casualties. So they came back from the front, injured in no man's land. The first scale of emergency treatment was what was called an RAP, a regimental aid post. So in fact, if the Staffords were fighting there, they would have their own regimental aid post staffed by the regimental medical officer. So he knew all these people that were filtered through his hands. What could he do? Tourniquets, Thomas splint, the metal frame for the legs, some form of morphine, a shell dressing to stop the bleeding. Very little else. Important was to move the patient back then in a sort of dogleg fashion, back to bigger and better facilities. So you had an RAP, regimental aid post. Then you'd have something like a casualty clearing station or a field ambulance, which could do a little bit more than the RAP and control his pain and his bleeding. And of course what they used to do, of course, if they'd got a tourniquet on or they'd received morphine, they'd mark it on their forehead. So when they transported them, people would know that they've got a tourniquet on, because a tourniquet needs to be released about every 15, 16 minutes, else you get death of tissue. And I can assure you, very sadly, that occurred. So back they went then, and then further back they went then to base general hospitals. So from the Somme, many of them were taken down the River Somme by barges. I've got an illustrated talk I give, and I've got pictures of the carriage of them backwards, and I've got some wonderful pictures of those barges. That was a very good way of transporting wounded soldiers rather than stop and start train or motor. So back they went and eventually landed at a place called Étaples, just outside Amiens, which was a huge tented hospital situation. And from there they were screened, and then they came across the channel. Now initially, for the first couple of years, the patients went all over the place. But by the time of the Somme, they'd streamlined the carriage system. So what they had, they used to use Reading Junction. So the casualties would go from Dover, Hythe, Chatham, wherever they were landed, and they would be taken then to, if they were Midlands and North, to Reading Junction. And what happened then, Wolverhampton of course had its own railway sidings and set up for producing locomotives. And what they did, they sent one of their best trains, coaled up and watered up, down to Reading. It would then hook up with carriages that had been destined for the Midlands. What was important about Reading, it was nice. A couple of hours from Dover, you could give them some more morphine, you could adjust their shell dressings, you could give them a warm drink, and then you could send them to Wolverhampton, which is what happened basically. Of course, Worsley was also well used as a general hospital. The problem was in coming back to Wolverhampton, Stephen said we had no health service. We had no ambulance service, can you believe? Can you imagine 40, 50 wounded soldiers coming into the low level? Thank God it was the low level, it had a decent assembly hall. And then you've got to get them to the Royal. So appeals went out for people with transport to go to the station and to pick them up and transport them then to the Royal, or if there were facial or eye injuries, they were taken to Chapel Ash. Now, the hospital was voluntary. It was the good folk of Bilston, I tell you now, that supported the Royal. It was their hospital, if you like. I can tell you that without a doubt. And they supported it, and the firms like Stewart and Lloyd's, John Thompson, Sankey's, all of them provided funds for the Royal. What the War Department did was, for every wounded soldier that was admitted, they gave the hospital £8, 4 and 6pence. I don't know where they got the 4 and 6pence from, but that was it. So the soldier could be himself in there for 6 weeks, but they'd still £8, that was it. Gather the money yourselves. One of the other features, of course, the surgery at the Royal was probably slightly less acute than what had happened on the battlefields. What took place was what was called debridement or curettage. Now, debridement means cutting away dead and infected tissue. No antibiotics. These soldiers had lots of dead and infected tissue which had to be cut away. And they used various dyes, types of iodine to impregnate the wounds. But sepsis was high. And the other thing was very high, and I felt this when I went to the Royal in the 50s, was a condition called osteomyelitis. And the reverberations of wounded soldiers with osteomyelitis lived on until probably the late 60s, when they discovered a couple of antibiotics that got into bony tissue. So osteomyelitis was a huge problem. Stephen mentioned psychosis. Respiratory disease was an enormous problem as well. And if you'd been gassed, then you needed to be treated and oxygenated and all of that. The Royal coped. Butler's Brewery sent every wounded soldier a bottle of beer. So it was guaranteed a bottle of beer. They'd lost half of their horses, of course, at Butler's. They were commandeered. So their drays were running on dry, but they provided beer for the wounded soldiers. The other associations, Salvation Army, magnificent. When they arrived at the low level, who were there with the tea wagon? The Sally Army, weren't they? Who were there? The Red Cross, the St John's, all the voluntary organisations. People in Bilston flocked there. The other thing they did from Bilston was they flocked into the grounds of the Royal, and they had to move. They were on a ground floor ward, Edward Ward. They had to move them upstairs. So great with the people coming in. Salvation Army, great. Visiting the wounded soldiers, taking them fruit, pencils, writing paper, doing letters for them, having their service. The Citadel was next to the library for the Salvation Army. They had a good band. They'd bring you down on Sunday mornings into the front of the Royal and entertain the troops and the people. Infirmary was much the same, but importantly, in 1915, we had the arrival of St Dunstan's for the blind, set up at St Dunstan's Church in London. Second World War, funny enough, it moved to Church Stretton, away from the bombs. But so the infirmary had set aside beds and sustained them for these wounded soldiers. And then lastly, of course, they'd got to go somewhere afterwards. So what there was a desperate look for, some form, convalescence was important. Wolverhampton had been fortunate. It had bought a place called Milford, out on the common there, out towards Stafford, Cannock Way, and they'd got that as a convalescent home. Shared the costs with Walsall. Walsall couldn't meet the costs. Wolverhampton sustained it. So it was places like that and large houses in Tetnall where they sent them for convalescence. And eventually, of course, then, fit enough, they were sent home. They were visited weekly by a pay officer, either from Worcester or Lichfield, would come and pay the soldiers. And I've got some nice pictures of where they went and snuck away at lunchtimes. And the Dartmouth Arms, the back of the Royal, I can assure you, was a favourite watering hole. It was Banksy's, but it was the favourite watering hole for the troops. And of course, they could go in there and meet generous people like you who would pay for a pint for them. And then, of course, lastly, we had the very great war memorials in honour of the men and the cemeteries. When you look around the Black Country, wherever you go, if you go to Brockmore, if you go to Briley Hill, if you go to Enville, if you go anywhere, you'll find wounded soldiers, dead soldiers' graves that were buried there. But and they came home and they had an awful legacy of respiratory disease, osteomyelitis, and all the attendant problems from their diseases. But they were attended to by generous people, and generous people who gave them money to provide their care. Thank you.